I'm Bob Short. This is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College and the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest today is Representative Kathy Ashe, an 18-year veteran of the Georgia General Assembly who represents, Midtown Atlanta. Welcome.
Downtown Atlanta.
Downtown. Welcome, Kathy. We're delighted to have you.
Glad to be here.
Before we get into your legislative career, let's talk a little bit about Kathy Ashe.
Kathy Ashe grew up in Tallahassee, Florida. I was actually born in Illinois. My parents were both university types, and we moved to Florida State University when I was 6. So Tallahassee was home. Perfect place for growing up. Marvelous combination of state government on one hand and universities on the other, between FAMU and Florida State. Tallahassee was a very academic government town. And so there were all sorts of opportunities that availed themselves of kids growing up there because we just happened to be there. I never went to the university school, but there was a great university school where many of my friends went to high school and junior high and elementary school. I went to the public system, loved it, walked to school, had great friends living in Benton Hills. A father who was very involved in establishing the junior college system in the state of Florida. So he spent a good bit of time working directly with the governor's office, and toward the end of my high school, that was Governor Ferris Bryant from Ocala. The interesting piece of trivia is that my father and Ferris had been in the Navy together. And so they were very close personal friends in addition to this professional developing a junior college system. So that offered me any number of political opportunities because simultaneously my mother was president of the state PTA. And so they were both traveling a great deal, and here was this high school kid left hanging, as I used to describe it, from a limb on one of the live oak trees in Tallahassee. And they knew better than to let me stay home alone. So I often spent nights at the governor's mansion. Ferris's daughter, Cecilia, was my age, and I was really the only person she knew when they came to Tallahassee. So here is this new governor's daughter in this high school that was a little confusing socially, and we got to be good friends, and I'd spend the night at the governor's mansion when my parents were out of town. So over Cheerios, Ferris Bryant made it real clear to me what a governor of a state did, how it worked, the kinds of decisions he was making. Parenthetically, nobody else in the mansion ate breakfast. So it was often the two of us scavenging around to find breakfast, almost always Cheerios. So government never seemed strange. So it's always been a part of who I am.
You attended Agnes Scott.
I did. I left Tallahassee because my parents were both convinced, and I was convinced, an only child, that going away was a good idea. I attended some classes at Florida State when I was in high school still, so it needed to be away from home, but not so far away from home. I came up here to Agnes Scott, and I've never left Atlanta.
Then you got a master's degree in education at Emory.
Well, we've got to go back to Agnes Scott. Agnes Scott was just an absolutely great place for me to go to college. It was a place where, well, I guess the little story helps. In high school, I made A's in physics. I made A's in physics because I could bake a chocolate cake. And the physics teacher, this was in the 60s, the physics teacher really liked chocolate cakes. I happened to be the only girl in the class. And so my assignment really wasn't to learn physics, but it was to provide a chocolate cake each of the semesters of the school year. So there was this little built-up frustration of, what can a woman do academically? And Agnes Scott provided that environment. I'm one of those folks who believes that every woman's education ought to include some single-sex education. We have a great new Atlanta high school for girls in Atlanta. I think it really serves a purpose. Because if you're not the leader if you're not the head of the class, if you're not involved in student government, who's going to do it? Now, I think it works as well if it's an elementary school, a college, a high school. But that little bit of this game belongs to the women, I think was very healthy and surely has some strong roots in my feminist perspective. So Agnes Scott was great. I took advantage of every opportunity Agnes Scott had, except figuring out what I was going to do when I grew up. And so one night I called home and said, what do I do? I'm about to have a degree and I don't have a clue about what I want to do after college. I think I might actually want to teach school. And both of my very education-oriented parents, I think, went into a state of deep, my goodness, it would have been nice to do this a little sooner, but what do you do about that? So I went to Emory and got an MAT in elementary education, and I loved doing it.
And then you taught.
Then I taught several years. The first year I taught, I was down in Griffin, and it was a fascinating experience because Emory had a number of MATs and they put them out for a full semester of teaching, usually with a teacher in the classroom. But the Griffin Spalding system needed somebody teaching 7th grade English, and they had no teacher in the classroom, so I got to be that teacher. Now, it was an interesting experience because 3 or 4 of us lived in an apartment in Griffin, actually a trailer in Griffin. It turned out that the people who'd lived there before us had been women of the night. And so there was great excitement about midnight for the first few nights we were there when the door knocked and people expected us to provide some service that we were not interested in providing. But that experience in the classroom convinced me that it was the right path and that middle school, junior high in those days, was really where I wanted to be. And so when I finished the degree and went to work, I went to work in Cobb County with a truly gifted educator, a fellow by the name of Tom Mathis. And Tom, over the years, played many roles, but he was the person who started the middle schools in Cobb and did it in a sort of controversial way. We had vast open space places where there was an English teacher, a math teacher, science teacher, social studies, and this mob of kids, no walls. I actually loved it. There were lots of folks who found it very difficult, and some kids who clearly found it difficult, that it didn't match their learning style. But I loved it, but it convinced me that what I really wanted to know how to do was help a student who had gotten all the way through that first part of school without really knowing how to read to learn. Some of them sort of read, but they didn't really know how to take that written word and turn it into something they could learn from. And so I went back to Georgia State and did a good bit of work in early reading and how do you teach kids to read. My favorite memories in the school system, and it was Cobb County the whole time, had to do with how do you help a kid unlock, mostly for himself in those days, the mystery that is the printed word. Sometimes that involved closing a door and teaching a kid how to crawl all over again. But I still keep up with some of those kids. That was a very meaningful experience, but in the meantime I got married. Still married to the same man, but got married, and it was difficult when we had a child to figure out how to drive from downtown Atlanta out to Cobb County to teach and back and forth. And so Cobb County let me teach half-time. They got a good deal. There were 2 of us who split a job. It was probably the first job share in K-12 education in Georgia. They got a good deal. They got 2 of us, no benefits, and each of us worked 3 days a week. Did that until our second child, Sally, was born, and then there was really just no way.
At some point, you became a legislative assistant to a great, great state representative, Kill Townsend.
Oh, you know, we've just lost Kill, and it's one of those that brings a tear to my eye thinking about him now. That actually came after a little bit. For a while, I really tried to stay home. I decided it was important to get involved in my children's education, get involved in what they were doing, and I loved it. Sally and Robbie, really fun, good kids. still to this day. But I wasn't very good at being home all the time. So I got involved in every league you could think of, from the Junior League to the Urban League to the League of Women Voters, and spent a great deal of time out in the community. And it was probably, well, it's the Junior League and the League of Women Voters that brought back all of those memories of Tallahassee and being a page and working in a kitchen with Ferris over Cheerios. And it seemed to me that there was something in that political arena. In those days, the Junior League was working on trying to convince folks to put seat belts and car restraints for children. And one of my favorite visits to the Capitol as a league volunteer was to meet with Paul Coverdale, to hear Paul talk about how one lobbied and how one made change in government and how this group of women volunteers could create a system in which kids were going to be in car seats because it was safer. The League of Women Voters, I was president of the Atlanta Fulton League, so very involved with the Fulton delegation down there, and got to know Kill Townsend. Marvelous man who's had skills beyond, sort of a Renaissance fellow in lots and lots of ways. Wrote books about colleges around the country and what you needed to do to get into them and what they were going to be like when you got there, sort of the early college guides. I finished my term as president of the league, and one night at a cocktail party, Kill Townsend said, "You need to come to the Capitol with me. I need you to be my aide." I thought, I don't know exactly what that means, but it's a good time to do it. There's a little window, there's a little crack, why not do it? So I did. Mm-hmm. He taught me the importance of constituent service. He taught me the importance of maintaining a sense of humor, and he was the person who thought it was ridiculous that we had sales tax on basic food, but not at all ridiculous that we had sales tax on lobsters and caviar. Yeah, there was a real sense of fairness in the Kill Townsend I knew. And of course, it harkens back to a time I was in Washington, one of my college summers. I spent the summer with Sam Gibbons, congressman from Tampa-St. Pete, back in the glory days of congressional interns. And Sam and Kill very much reminded me of each other, different political parties, but still that real emphasis on the constituent they served. For Sam Gibbons, I did three things. I wrote new baby letters to every baby who was born in his district. I wrote wedding letters to every couple that got married in the Tampa-St. Pete district. And I took folks from Florida on tours of Washington. First day I was there, he pulled into his pocket and he threw the keys across the desk at me and he said, "Please go get my car. I need to go to the airport." "Yes, Congressman, how do I fit into that plan?" He said, "You're going to drive me." So I found his car, we found the airport, and at the end of it, he took a key off of it and he said, "This is for you for the summer. Every time somebody from Tampa, St. Pete comes to my office and needs a tour, you're going to take them." And so, and then he pulled out a list and he said, here are the things you need to see. And my only rule is you can't see any of them until you've seen them all. So constituent service. I mean, people thought I was actually knowledgeable about what I was learning about because I had to learn real fast the night before I took them someplace.
At what point did you decide to run for office?
Never had crossed my mind that I would run for office. I loved being behind the scenes. I loved working on causes that needed advocacy. I loved working with the folks who were getting the job done. But then John Lupton decided midterm that he was going to stop and go work for the Olympics, and that he really couldn't be a legislator and do that at the same time, and so there was an open seat. And like many of, particularly women who got in office in the 90s, it was one of those places where a crack developed and people said, well, why don't you do it? It took a little while to convince myself that that was a good thing to do, but I jumped in.
You now represent a district you refer to as the Peachtree Road race.
That was the first district I represented, and that's a district that really is the northern heart of Atlanta, from Lenox Square down to Ansley Park, where our family lives. It was a great district, a fun place to run. First race, there were 7 other candidates in the race. I'll never forget in the runoff, driving up Peachtree to discover this little stack of ashes in front of an apartment building with a title that said Atlanta was sent to the ashes once before. Don't vote for that ash woman.
Ooh.
We learned lots about politics that first time around. Some of the folks are great friends, were great friends, and maintain that friendship with them to this day. A couple of the others I've never seen again, and I'm grateful. But that was the time our son turned 16 during that election. He thought driving to put up a yard sign was the best thing that ever happened. And our daughter learned to answer the telephone. So it was a real family effort. My husband gets very involved. He's a good fundraiser, and he's a real good cheerleader.
How many times has your district been reapportioned?
It seems like over and over and over again, and virtually every year. And it does happen on a fairly regular basis. It was that first one, and then we went through that series of looking at multi-member districts. In some ways, I think it was the Democratic Party getting a little selfish. And we tried to preserve some districts by putting 4 of them together, 3 of which were solid Democratic districts, 1 of which might have been a Republican district, and to make it a multi-member district. And so people ran in these big mega districts. So we had one episode of that when we went into DeKalb County. It was a different kind of race. It was about the size of a Senate district. And then there was the reapportionment after I changed political parties, and that one changed the makeup of this district substantially.
Let's talk about your decision to change parties. Why?
I'd love to go back to 2001 and do it all over again, because other than marrying my husband Lawrence, it was probably the soundest decision I ever made. I didn't change at all myself, except my party label. I'm not wearing pearls today, but as I described in those days, I wore pearls before I changed, and I wore pearls after I changed. My political philosophy is still very much the same that it had always been. I had, as a moderate Republican, I was in favor of a woman and a family's right to make reproductive choices. I was very much in favor of getting the Confederate battle emblem off the state flag. I had been very involved in education reform from the very beginning. And Bob Irvin, who was, in those days when I was a moderate Republican, our party leader, put up with that. And it was not seen as, clearly people looked at me and said, you're that liberal Republican. But I was exactly who I was. And then we changed party leaders. And I was told that I could no longer support changing the Confederate battle emblem off the state flag. And I was told that I could no longer support the Roy Barnes education reform efforts that I'd been working on the entire time that he'd been governor, and that I believed in strongly, the same things they were doing in Texas with George W. Bush. And I guess my family would tell you that you don't tell me what to do very well, at least if you expect me to follow the direction you're giving me. And so I went home after that direction giving and thought, I gotta brush my teeth. I gotta be able to look myself in the mirror. I've gotta be who I am. And if politics makes me into somebody else, it's not worth it. And so I turned around and in January of 2001, wrote all of the people who had just elected me as a Republican, no opposition on either side in that election, and said, because I can't be who I am where I am, I need to move to a broader tent, and I'm going to be a moderate Democrat. So here I am. Mm-hmm. I still believe in all those things I believed in.
What do you think caused that shift in the Republican Party?
Oh, I wish I know, because I think it's been detrimental to real substance in politics and in public policy. I think it's much more based on a set of, I have mine and I'm going to keep mine, and I don't really much care about somebody else. I think it's a much more, these are the absolutes, and here are the hoops you're going to jump through, and everybody's going to jump through them. And I don't think people are quite that in one place.
How did moderate Republicans like Gil Townsend and Paul Coverdale react to that shift of philosophy?
Bothered Gil Townsend until the day he died. He was an unhappy camper with the way in which the Republican Party had evolved in Georgia, and I suspect nationally. I think Paul went the other way and just became a part of it. I think going to Washington tends to make you play more solidly in one camp or the other. In the Georgia legislature in those days, as you well know, people sort of flitted back and forth across lines. It maybe had more to do with urban-rural. It had to do with Democrats being fairly conservative. And you know, when I think about Tom Murphy, I don't think of somebody who was very liberal. I think about somebody who had sort of like, I like to think about myself as being fiscally conservative and socially open, socially progressive.
Tom Murphy is a Georgia legend. How did you get along with him?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to say it. The first time I went in to see Tom Murphy, I had just been elected, and you went in to see Tom and Mr. Murphy, and you waited a good long while to get in to see him, and you sat down, and he pointed to a sofa on which you were supposed to sit, and I sat down on that sofa, and I realized that it was probably not the best angle to be sitting, because the sofa sloped just like that. And so your bottom was way down low and your knees were way up high, and you were literally looking through your knees to see him. We had an interesting discussion. I was immediately impressed with how much he knew about this new member of the legislature. I came in at the same time that Louise McBee from Athens came in, and she had told me that it was an interesting interview, and it really was an interesting interview because he wanted to know what I wanted to do and what I was interested in, and so I immediately talked about my interest in education and my interest in natural resources, and he said, well, I'm going to put you on the Banks and Banking Committee. I sort of looked at him and I said, well, you know, Ms. Murphy, I think that's probably a real good thing for me to learn about. And I remember that in your early days in the legislature, you chaired the Banks and Banking Committee. So if I run into questions about it, may I just come in here and ask you what it is I ought to be doing about a particular issue? Well, little lady, how'd you know that? I said, Miss Murphy, you've learned a little bit about me before I came in here today. I would have been foolish not to learn a little bit about you before I came in here today. He and I had a great relationship. Before I left that day, I said, I'm never sitting on this sofa again. And he laughed at me and he said, probably a good idea. And at that point, he in many ways took me under his wing. And when he would rule on one of the House rules and make a decision, he would look over at me and with his fingers give me the number of the rule, so that I actually learned the little red book fairly well, fairly quickly, with his help. You know, surely there were some things that drove us all crazy about him, but a real, real Georgia legend.
You've been through some very historical times. Here we are in 2010 with a severe economic problem in Georgia. You're on the Appropriations Committee.
I am.
What do we do?
We don't expect a magic bullet. We don't say this is going to be over in 6 months or 9 months or 3 years. I think we move toward a more stable source of not only funding, but a little critical source of what freebies we give away. And we clearly need to look at many of the tax exemptions that we've created over the years. We need to make sure, and we did with a bill this year, that there's some evaluation of if indeed we give a company a tax break of X, Y, or Z, do they really bring the jobs to Georgia? Do they really contribute economically to the state? Or did we just give that away and never hold anybody accountable? We need to be much more accountable on those. I think we need to be more accountable in how we spend money. I think we have to really figure out what our priorities are. This year's budget I voted against because my priority is education. And we saw draconian cuts, both in K-12 and in higher ed, that I think will in the long time be damaging to our state. I think we need to get more conservative about how we decide how to use energy. I think it's important that we make our buildings energy efficient. I think it's important that we make some investments that are going to cost money, that are going to pay out over time. You know, it's depressing and it's sad, but it's not impossible. I mean, families all over Georgia are figuring out how to live in tougher times, and maybe we'll never go back to thinking we can afford everything all the time.
You've spent much of your time and energy on education. Let me ask you a general question. Are we spending on education what we should and in the right way?
Those are really hard questions to ask because it's real hard to know how individual systems are spending money. I mean, we talk about the word accountable, but we're not yet in a place that in education we can say, if we spend these dollars on this program, this group of kids will achieve this achievement. There's not the accountability for how the dollars are spent for the results they produce. So we may be funding some things we don't need to fund, and we may be not funding some things we ought to be funding. Sometimes I think we are penny wise and pound foolish. The idea that we've decided art doesn't need to be in K-12 education, I just don't believe that. I believe that art and music have a role to play in, for instance, how do you learn math? Your math in upper level courses is going to be better if you've had some music training along the way. So I think we got to really look at what it is we're doing, find ways to be accountable, and find ways to spend money where we need to. I'm not prepared to say we're not spending enough. I think some places we're probably spending too much, but there are clearly places where we are spending too little and maybe on the wrong things.
Should we rely on the federal government to help fund education?
Education has to be a partnership. It has to be a partnership that starts with a child's parents and that early childhood education. It's got to be a partnership with the community resources that help children come to school healthy, ready to learn. Local government has to play a role. I really believe in local control of education. Our Constitution tells us we have to do that, and I think folks closest to the kids know what's important. They've got to have some skin in the game. States got to have some skin in the game, and as we as a country compete internationally, the federal government has to have some skin. Yes, I believe we're all part of this, and it's working out who does what for whom when. That's the hard part.